Hello, everyone. Before we begin, I'll just share a couple of quick procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function to post questions to our speakers. At the end of the webinar, we'll make sure to have plenty of time to answer any questions that come up for you. You'll also notice that there is a survey at the end of the webinar. It will be on your screen as a QR code. It will be shared in the chat through a link and also in an email following the webinar. Please take just a few minutes to take the survey. Let us know what you liked and what you'd like to see in future webinars. You'll also notice that the webinar is being recorded. That means this webinar will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly, and you can revisit this webinar and share it and all of our previous webinars. After I'm done with the introduction, I'll post that in the chat. Without further ado, welcome to the Alliance Against Violence and Adversity's Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yersich. With Ava, I'm an early career researcher on the webinar series, or early career researcher and lead on the webinar series. Outside of that, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, housed in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University, and faculty in the social sciences at Capilano University. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, and on behalf of Ava, I want to begin by acknowledging that, on a national level, we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We, as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is gender-based violence and disability justice, moving toward collective liberation. We are joined today by Dr. Stefanie Hunt-Kennedy and Dr. Yvonne Simpson from the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Center for Family Violence Research at the University of New Brunswick. Dr. Yvonne Simpson holds a Purdy Crawford TD Bank postdoctoral fellowship in accessibility at Muriel McQueen Fergusson Center and is an educator, researcher, and disability justice practitioner whose scholarship draws on the theories of intersectionality, critical race theory, and critical disability studies to interrogate gaps and distortions in gender-based violence. Dr. Stefanie Hunt-Kennedy is a professor in history and director of the Muriel McQueen Fergusson Center at the University of New Brunswick. She is a multi-award-winning interdisciplinary scholar whose research explores the historical and contemporary intersections between disability, gender, race, and violence. Dr. Simpson and Kennedy, or Hunt-Kennedy, sorry. Thank you so much for joining us today. I look forward to your webinar.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that warm introduction. And thanks to everyone who's joining us today. So as Sarah said, my name is Stefanie Hunt-Kennedy. I'm a white cis woman. I'm zooming in from Fredericton on the unceded and unsurrendered lands of the Wolastoqey. I'm also a disabled and CRIP scholar who studies disability, slavery, and emancipation, colonialism and mad histories in the Caribbean and vast early Americas, as well as contemporary linkages between family violence and disability. So a commitment to access drives much of my work in disability history and disability studies, and I'd like to extend that practice with you today and make explicit the invitation during this gathering to stretch, get up, move around, stim, knit, do what you need to do in order to take care of yourself, including leave the talk if and when you need to. As part of our commitment to access, a copy of our slides is available to anyone who'd like to take our presentation in at a different pace and place, recognizing that environmental barriers, among other things, impact our ways of learning. In addition, as part of being inclusive, I want to alert you to some potentially sensitive and disturbing language and subject matter to come. Today, we will be discussing the historical and contemporary intersections between disability and violence, which includes stories of activism and progress and collective care, from which I hope you draw nourishment and inspiration. But we will also confront varied forms, practices, and structures of violence toward disabled people, particularly disabled women and children. These are further complicated by intersections of race, indigeneity, class, sexuality, and other social categories. So I encourage you to take care of yourself during and after this talk. So today's talk will cover four main topics. What is disability and how has society interpreted it? A brief overview of Canadian disability history and why a historical perspective is key to understanding disability and gender-based violence today. Disability and GBV in global, national, and provincial scales, and our own individual research projects. So myself and Yvonne will share a little bit about our works in progress. So roughly 25% of all women in Canada live with a disability. 55% of these women have experienced intimate partner violence. Additionally, disabled women are 2 to 3 times as likely as non-disabled women to experience sexual violence. Violence can also be a result of, violence can also result in disability. In other words, women are becoming disabled as a result of IPV. For today's presentation, we want to show you how disability studies and disability history can enrich our understanding of the relationship between disability and gender-based violence. So through my own part, I want to demonstrate particularly that violence against disabled women and children is not accidental, nor is it simply the result of individual acts of harm. Rather, it is rooted in historical ideas about disability that have shaped institutions, policies, social attitudes for centuries. To understand the violence disabled people experience today, we first need to understand how disability itself has been understood. So I'll begin with a critical disability studies approach to the question, what is disability? From there, I will introduce you to the theoretical models of disability that have shaped disability rights movements and scholarship, and how scholars have brought these models to history to see what we can learn about disability experiences in the Canadian past. Ultimately, what I want to show you is that the history and theoretical frameworks in disability scholarship provides new understandings, strategies, and solutions to attend to GBV among disabled Canadian populations. So what is disability? Disability is not a single experience or identity. It includes a wide range of physical, sensory, psychological, intellectual, developmental, cognitive, and learning conditions. Disabilities can be congenital, acquired, temporary, permanent, or episodic. Many of us will acquire disabilities through the natural process of aging if we are fortunate to live long enough. And even childhood is a particular form of disability. In other words, disability is not a marginal issue affecting only a small group of people, but rather a near universal human condition. In Canada, the Accessible Canada Act defines disability broadly as a physical, mental, intellectual, cognitive, learning, communication, or sensory impairment or functional limitation that in interaction with social, political, and cultural barriers hinder a person's full participation in society. So as this definition suggests, disability is not simply about an individual's body or mind, but about the relationship between people and the environments they inhabit. Then we have ableism, a system of power that hierarchically ranks people based on preconceived and subjective notions of productivity, efficiency, independence, achievement, capacity, fitness, and progress. Now, this might seem like a purely theoretical discussion, but ableism shapes how society defines disability and bodies in general, bodies and minds, which in turn shapes who receives support, who is excluded, who is considered capable, and whose experiences of violence are recognized. So this brings us to what scholars call the models of disability. These models are helpful in understanding how society has and continues to understand disability. These understandings shape policy, social attitudes, and the treatment of disabled people. They also influence how people interpret violence against disabled people. So historically, one of the oldest frameworks was the moral or religious model of disability. So during the 15th through to the 17th centuries, many people interpreted disability as a sign of sin, punishment, moral failing, or kind of a divine judgment. Congenital disabilities were sometimes described as, quote, monstrous births, and disabled children could be viewed as evidence of God's wrath or a mother's wayward imagination. People also sometimes saw disability as a spiritual gift or a test, an opportunity for suffering, patience, or moral growth. In many cases, disability was also a way for others to demonstrate their own charitable nature, a perspective rooted in pitying those with disabilities. Although these interpretations differed, the approaches positioned disability as something negative rather than a part of human diversity. Although many people today reject explicitly religious explanations of disability, traces of the moral model remain embedded in contemporary culture whenever disability is framed as something that requires an explanation or justification. So here I'm thinking of people, like, why me? What did I do to deserve this? Beginning in the late 18th century, a different framework emerged that would become increasingly influential: the medical model of disability. The medical model understands disability as an individual defect, abnormality, or personal tragedy that should be treated, cured, rehabilitated, and prevented. Medical professionals increasingly defined what counted as normal, and anyone outside those norms was categorized as deficient and abnormal. This model led to the institutionalization, forced sterilization, and segregation of disabled people and other forms of violence. It also reinforced the idea that certain people were inferior and needed to be fixed in order to participate fully in society. This measuring stick impacted disabled and non-disabled people alike, and it particularly affects people from marginalized communities, irrespective of disability. The consequences of the medical model extend far beyond hospitals, clinics, or public policy. Its assumptions about normalcy and productivity also shape popular culture and everyday interactions. One of the clearest examples can be found in how disability is often represented through narratives of pity or personal triumph. These overcoming narratives celebrate disabled people for supposedly triumphing over their bodies simply by living ordinary lives. Disability activist Stella Young criticized this phenomenon as inspiration porn, when disabled people are used as motivational objects for non-disabled audiences. As she put it, no amount of smiling at a flight of stairs has ever made it turn into a ramp. In other words, disabled people are not the problem. Rather, the environmental, social, cultural, and political barriers are. This point is particularly important for understanding gender-based violence. When disability is understood as a defect located within the individual, attention is often diverted away from the social conditions that create vulnerability and harm. Violence becomes individualized rather than recognized as a structural issue. In response to the limitations of the medical model, disability activists in the 1960s and 70s developed the social model of disability. The social model emphasizes that disability is produced by social and physical barriers, institutional, economic, and attitudinal barriers that exclude people from full participation in society. So these barriers can be physical, so think like inaccessible transportation, a lack of captions or sign language interpretation, buildings without ramps or elevators, inaccessible healthcare systems. But the barriers are also attitudinal, so stereotyping, infantilization, pity, assumptions about competence, or the belief that disabled people are burdensome, dependent, asexual, etc. So the social model shifted attention away from fixing individuals and toward changing society. Now, some critics argue that the social model can kind of overlook the embodied realities of chronic pain, illness, fatigue, or mental distress that can accompany disability. But despite its limitations, the social model fundamentally transformed how scholars understood disability. And its influence extended beyond activism into academic fields such as history, where researchers began asking new questions about disability in the past. So far, we've explored how disability scholars conceptualize disability in the present, but these ideas also provide powerful tools for understanding the past. One of my favorite quotations is by a scholar named William Loren Katz, who, when speaking of slavery, wrote, "If you believe people have no history worth mentioning, it's easy to believe they have no humanity worth defending." And I feel like this quote is widely applicable to other marginalized communities, including disability communities. Only by carefully understanding the history of disability and the resistance and liberatory practice of disabled people can we develop strategies that impact social change today. So historians now think about how disability has been defined and experienced across different historical contexts, and what those histories can teach us about contemporary inequalities. So a disability history perspective treats disability as both an embodied experience and a social category whose meanings change across time and place. So therefore, disability must be understood in specific historical contexts. For example, under slavery, it was not uncommon for watchmen, these were enslaved men who were tasked with watching the fields at night for runaways or other so-called criminal activity. It was not uncommon for these men to have sight impairments. And that kind of strikes us as odd, right? In other historical contexts, such as industrialized North America or Europe, this condition would have been grounds for exclusion from labor. But because enslaved people's bodies and lives were owned and not their time, like free laborers, enslavers wrung every bit of labor out of their bodies until they were of no use to plantation production. As a result, enslaved people with disabilities continued to labor in sugar production and other forms of slave production. Another example comes from 19th century Canada, where being disappointed in love, so losses in business, family, love, these were reasons for purported insanity and admission to lunatic asylums. So these examples demonstrate that ableism has shapeshifted throughout history, defining who and what constitute physical and mental difference based on social and cultural ideals. So these broader insights became especially powerful when we examined specific historical contexts. In the Canadian context, disability has long been used as a justification for exclusion, confinement, and the denial of rights. For centuries, individuals of a variety of physical and mental differences, who were often labeled as disabled, were frequently segregated in institutions, psychiatric hospitals, training schools, and residential facilities under the assumption that they needed correction or cure. Women and girls were especially vulnerable within these systems. Many experienced forced confinement, abuse, sterilization, and the denial of reproductive autonomy under Canada's eugenic policies. Disabled children were routinely separated from their families and excluded from mainstream education and community life. Sexual, physical, and emotional abuse was common in institutions for children and adults deemed disabled. Large institutions that incarcerated disabled and non-disabled people continued to operate across Canada well into the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In Ontario, for example, the Huronia Regional Centre, an institution for people understood to have intellectual disabilities, did not close until 2009. Former residents came forward with accounts of widespread physical abuse, neglect, isolation, and forced labor. Survivors also described overcrowding, restraints, sexual violence, and the denial of basic dignity. So ableism made it possible to isolate disabled people from their families, communities, and public oversight, which in turn created the conditions for institutional violence disguised as altruism. Understanding this history kind of begs the question, are there ways that we today understand a certain practice as helping disabled people without recognizing the harm it causes? Although many institutions closed and important legal reforms were achieved, ableist assumptions did not disappear. Instead, they often resurfaced in new forms, sometimes relieving themselves in public debates about the value of disabled lives. So, for instance, in 1993, Tracy Latimer, a 12-year-old girl from Saskatchewan with cerebral palsy, was killed by her father, Robert Latimer. Robert claimed that he acted out of compassion. The significance of the case was not only the murder itself, but the public response. Many Canadians expressed sympathy for her father rather than Tracy herself, a disabled child subjected to lethal family violence. Disability activists across Canada argued that this response revealed how deeply ableist assumptions about suffering, dependency, and quality of life remained embedded within Canadian society. The significance of the Latimer case extends beyond the 1990s. Disability activists have repeatedly pointed out that many of the assumptions revealed in the public responses to Tracy's murder continue to shape contemporary policy debates, particularly in relation to the vulnerability of disabled people within Track 2 of Canada's MAID regime, which provides assisted death solely on the basis of disability. Debates surrounding Track 2 of MAID cannot be separated from broader social conditions. Poverty, inadequate healthcare, inaccessible services, and the ongoing threat of institutionalization all shape the choices available to disabled people. And these conditions disproportionately affect disabled women and gender diverse people, demonstrating how structural inequality continues to influence questions of life, autonomy, and dignity. Disabled people were never merely subjects of these oppressive systems. They challenged them, organized against them, sometimes even within them, and demanded alternatives. In the 1960s and 70s, disabled people increasingly began organizing politically. Influenced by feminist, civil rights, and anti-poverty movements, disability rights activists challenged institutionalization and demanded equal access to housing, education, employment, transportation, and community living. Ironically, some institutions intended to isolate disabled people from the wider society brought them together and facilitated disability activism and network building. Across Canada, women serving and disability-led organizations were built by and for the communities they serve, demonstrating the transformative power of peer support and collective action. These organizations have shown what is possible when shared experiences of oppression and shared resilience are organized into meaningful solutions. Organizations such as Dawn Canada, Indigenous Disability Canada, Disability Alliance Canada, and the Council of Canadians with Disabilities and Disability Without Poverty helped push disability into public and political conversations as human rights issues rather than a matter of charity. So looking across this history, we can see that the violence experienced by disabled women and children today has deep historical roots, and that gender-based violence against disabled women and children is a systemic issue, rooted in intersecting historical structures of exclusion and devaluation. This realization has led many activists to move beyond a framework focused solely on inclusion and accessibility toward one centered on disability justice. Created by disability collectives in response to the disability rights movements, which often centered white, excuse me, physically disabled people while overlooking the experiences of people who are marginalized in multiple ways. Disability justice centers the priorities and approaches of those most historically excluded groups, such as women, racialized people, queer folks, and people with disabilities that are either underrepresented or highly stigmatized. Disability justice offers an important framework for addressing gender-based violence and people who live at the intersecting junctions of oppression. As Dawn Canada notes, quote, while many gender-based violence policies mention vulnerable groups in their preambles, women with disabilities and deaf women are often reduced to footnotes. They are generally referred to broadly as people with disabilities or categorized as part of a vulnerable group, failing to fully address their specific needs and experiences, end quote. Too often, service providers and governments assume a non-disabled survivor when designing GBV services, policies, and prevention strategies. This narrow understanding is also reflected in common definitions of intimate partner violence, which can obscure the reality that many disabled women experience violence not only from intimate partners, but from family members, friends, healthcare providers, and personal attendants. As a result, many disabled survivors remain invisible within existing discourses and face additional barriers when seeking support. Indeed, today, disabled women and children experience similar forms of gender-based violence as their non-disabled peers, but they are also exposed to violence that target their disabilities. And my colleague, Yvonne Simpson, will speak more to this. So taking a cue from disability justice, I want to encourage GBV research and service to move beyond asking for individual access and inclusion and toward collective access and interdependence. To do so, we must strengthen our commitment to center disabled people, the experiences of disabled people, women and girls. We must have an expectation of difference, right? That there's going to be difference across all sorts of different social categories. And we must provide space for people to be their whole selves, so they're not just in one category. And we must connect with other movements for justice and liberation. As we've seen, ableism, misogyny, racism, sexism, and other intersecting systems of oppression have shaped whose safety is prioritized, whose lives are considered worth protecting, and ultimately whose lives are valued in society. Disability history helps us recognize how these structures were created and maintained over time. Disability justice provides a vision of how they might be dismantled. So in the spirit of Sins Invalid, we must move together with no body or mind left behind to challenge these inequitable systems and create more just futures for everyone. I'll now turn it over to my friend and colleague, Dr. Yvonne Simpson, to share more about the state of violence against disabled women and children today.
Thank you so much, Stefanie. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Sarah. And I would like to thank you, everyone, for being here today. For me, it is a privilege to be here and to be speaking with you. I am speaking from East Gwillimbury, Ontario. This area was part of the Williams Treaties. I would like to recognize the Indigenous and First Peoples who have cared for these lands since time immemorial. This area has been home to many Indigenous peoples, namely the Wendat, Huron, the Chionantati, also known as Petun, the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, as well as the Chippewas of Georgina Island First Nations. In this presentation today, I would like to focus mostly on demographic data reporting of disability, first at the global level and then the national and provincial level, to underscore the challenges of accessibility from an intersectional lens in reference to disabled women, gender-based violence. I will then segue in ending to provide a brief connection to my research project. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide.
So
As you,
I was so entranced by your presentation. I forgot I have a job. I will pay attention.
Nice to know you were entrenched. You're entranced. Thanks, Steph. As you would have gathered from Dr. Hunt Kennedy's overview of disability, there is no argument that disability has been conceptualized and defined in various ways, depending on perspectives, context, and lived experiences. But there are some essential facts on which we can all agree. First, our understanding of disability continues to evolve and invokes consideration of both past and present conditions of disabled people's lived experiences. These experiences have necessitated the creation of laws to entrench accessibility, inclusion, and legislative protections from discrimination. So, for example, I'd like to engage you in some thinking for a moment. For example, across Canada and all jurisdictions, disability anti-discrimination laws exist along with accessibility development processes. But these have never delivered on an end to the inequities and barriers. The second thing that we can gather from the overview is the interpretation of disability will differ depending on the context and the position from which one is speaking. So, for example, an adjudicator in a disability claims unit may focus on determining eligibility for benefits based on how disability is defined under the provisions of a disability group insurance contract. An educator, for example, may be concerned about how to build universal design in the curriculum so that all students can have equity in the learning environment. A clinical nurse in the emergency care room may be concerned about how to adjust diagnostic instruments to meet the diverse needs of patients coming through. These scenarios may not prompt academic critical reflections, but altogether, they may generate some thoughts about our shared histories, our past and present, that we are all affected as we go about our daily lives and communities where we live, work, and hope to enjoy a good life, no matter where we go or desire to have our needs met. This brings me to the third and perhaps the most unifying, irrefutable among the foregoing information that we've just heard. Disability is a human experience. We can all agree that that is an irrefutable fact. If we haven't already done so, we will at some point have a connection with the largest minoritized demographic group globally. As reported by the World Health Organization, over 1.3 billion people nationwide, worldwide, or 1 in 6 of us live with some form of disability. This is not one of those small issue off the side, but rather a massive human global lived reality. Within this common thread of human existence, the vast majority of people living with disabilities experience accessibility barriers. But in this cadre of irrefutable facts, women, girls, and children are at the highest risk for bearing the brunt of disability disparities due to acquired injuries from violence, leading to permanent disabilities sometimes. Next. Bringing this from the global to the national domain, there is much that we can learn from the Canadian Survey on Disability, or CSD for short. As the nation's official source for reporting on disability prevalence, the CSD uses a social model approach for establishing a national statistical data reference point. This is important because as we speak about advancing the idea of collective liberation, we must have tools for tracing how we are doing as a nation relative to creating an inclusive and barrier-free society. And this must be premised on disability representation. So we must know who's represented in the community. What are their experiences? And having mechanisms for disabled people to share their experiences is a crucial part of this process. Collective liberation then means that we must then work collectively to recognize and ultimately dismantle the barrier-laden environment. When reviewing recent demographic data statistical reporting, which was released in 2023, as illustrated here on the map on this slide, There are some key takeaways. We begin to learn that 8 million people, or 27% of Canada's population, report having one or more disabilities. But on a whole, Canadians report having multiple co-occurring types of disabilities. As estimated, 30% of Canadians indicate having one type of disability, while 37% had two or more types, and 34% of Canadians had four or more types of disabilities. That's huge. Overall, the rate of disability increased by almost 5% in the national average of 4.7% since 2017. One of the causes attributed to this increase is the growth of the senior population. Another key takeaway is that there's a high proportion of people with disabilities in Eastern Canada versus the rest of the country. With the exception of the Yukon Territories in the northwestern part at 31.4%, Nunavut stands out as having the smallest proportion of disabled people at 19.3%. Conversely, Nova Scotia at 37.9% has the highest disability rate, followed by New Brunswick, which has the second highest at 35.3%. But the distinction with New Brunswick is that the prevalence rate has doubled since the past census period to 8.6% and almost double the national average. When it comes to gender disability, women are also more likely than men to have more severe disabilities. 43% of women and 39% of men experience disabilities. But this disparity and the inequities facing disabled people, especially women and girls, is only part of the story, which cannot be fully understood based on statistics alone. Next slide. When we look at how statistics has been gathered, the statistics on disability reporting continues to evolve to reflect the diversity of population representation, as well as expression of identity, as noted here on the infographic. The progression to track and the progression of tracking commenced with the medical model lens, which was part of gathering information about labor force participation of disabled people in 1983. This was the Canadian Health and Disability Survey, which was provided as a supplement to the Labor Force Survey. But in 1986 and 1991, the Health and Activity Limitation Survey, HALS as it was called, was a hybrid way of reporting on disability. It was the first hybrid census reporting survey which asked questions about health and activities levels. The 2001 and 2006 Participation Limitation Survey, also a hybrid model, edged towards gathering information about limitations. But commencing in 2012 and continuing through to the present time, the social model has gained ground. And this is where we are now. Disability studies scholars and researchers have helped us in learning more about disability rights movement, which has followed on the heels of the civil rights struggles. Disability scholars in of itself, disability scholarship, that is in of itself viewed as a form of advocacy, with disabled scholars making contributions to knowledge dissemination. The disability rights movement, with its own mantra, "Nothing about us without us," characterizes the importance of self-advocacy by disabled people themselves. In the Canadian context, this evolution has taken shape based on key events. The Canadian Charter of Rights, the Canadian Disability Scholars Innes and Neufeld, who have traced this history in their seminal publication, In Pursuit of Equal Participation, have identified that the passage of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in 1982, particularly Section 15, affirming the rights of equal rights for disabled people, and the Employment Equity Act of 1986, which instituted equality in employment hiring practices for the four equity-deserving groups: Indigenous peoples, disabled people, women, racialized people, all served as watershed periods in the struggle for disability rights in Canada. It was hard fought for. The building of institutions from the 1800s and their ultimate dismantling also was a first wave of movement of disability freedom. Commencing in the 1990s to the First World War, we saw the creation of programs and services. The scholars regarded this as a second wave. And then the third wave in the 70s, where we are still advancing on some of the foundations built there, we now are moving towards a period of collective liberation with human rights framework. Canadian scholars Jeffrey Room provides a reminder that this work is ultimately about justice. It is also involving changing attitudes and being aware of the history that people have lived through and continue to experience. It hasn't gone away. The Canadian Survey on Disability, as well as the studies of scholars, have provided us with a pathway for engaging in discussions about disability. A key takeaway here is, rather than medicalizing disability, consider the 10 types provided by the Canadian Disability Survey. It's in fact how disabled people have described their experiences. It's about seeing, hearing, mobility, and flexibility, and the like, as we move through the community. As we move towards collective liberation, then, in recognition that disability is a human experience, we must then move away from how we think about disability, away from the notion that has been socially constructed as residing within people, to be cured or fixed. And we must then look towards placing the emphasis towards systemic and structural barriers that must recognize from experiences with lived environments that are not supportive and is not necessarily inclusive. Simply put, we must begin to think about our human dignity and the environment of access that must be built with inclusion in mind. Dignity is and indignity is stirred when this fails. Next slide. Mental health-related disabilities had the largest increase in the gathering of statistics about disability in Canada, with 38.6% of Canadians reporting mental health-related conditions. Pain remains the most common types of disability experiences, with 62% of Canadians reporting similar to that of 2017 at 65%. This tells us there's work to be done. Looking at disability at the local and provincial levels in New Brunswick, disability rate is highest among seniors at 45.9%, among youths at 19.3%. And when we think about who are the people most affected, well, in our community at large, 20% of persons in New Brunswick live with very severe disabilities, and that's large. Next. Let us then take a look at how disability and accessibility matters in New Brunswick. The vast majority of disabled people in New Brunswick, that's 55.1%, report experiencing difficulties inside and outside spaces. Just think about not being able to effectively use your space. 46.6% report communication barriers, and 35.4% report experiencing behavioral or attitudinal misconceptions and assumptions. 12.9% of those who report in the survey indicate that they have problems with access to the internet. Now, this is captured by the survey. It tells us something, though, and we must be mindful that though this number is small, it can be relatively lethal, because imagine someone or many people in the community, though it is a small group, who may be trying to find a safe way out of violence, or who may be trying to communicate with family members or link with others for life supporting accesses. If they cannot access the internet, and this is their main way of connecting to the outside world, this 12% becomes huge. Let's turn our minds to gender-based violence. For a long time, and since 1995, the Government of Canada has made commitment to promoting diversity and inclusion in public service. This is an initiative that has been going on since around the time we're connecting census data. But what does this mean with this knowledge? Let's look at the environments that we currently are using. Based on the most currently available information from Disabled Women's Network Canada, DAWN, 71% of women with disabilities using formal supports experience barriers. This reality should set off alarm bells to prompt action everywhere. Let us think about this in another way. Imagine, if you will, a disabled woman who may be in a situation experiencing violence. This could be physical, psychological, spiritual, or the like. Yet, with the mindset of making an exit from that situation, she remains held in because of accessibility barriers. This is a serious threat to safety. Next. Bringing this closer to home, the intersecting point of disability and gender-based violence is undeniable. We're provided with some information from the New Brunswick's government's report in 2023 that tell us that 39%, there has been a 39% increase in intimate partner violence, which was the highest nationwide. New Brunswick, we have problems. Furthermore, according to this same report, 21% in 2021, the summation report provided by Laura Savage tells us that in public safety spaces, in every province, and I quote, in every province, women with disabilities were almost twice as likely as women without disabilities to report physical or sexual assaults by an intimate partner at least once since the age of 15. This is startling. In the face of these types of startling evidence-based streams of information, in June 2025, the New Brunswick government declared gender-based violence an epidemic. But what can we do about this? It is interesting to note that while we have post-census surveys to tell us about the experiences of disability, we still rely on sources of information such as admissions to shelters where women share their experiences. The New Brunswick Shelter Report tells us a great deal about gender-based violence. It's remarkable that 92% of those admitted in 2020 to 2021 experienced psychological abuse. Women are sharing with us, and we find out from shelter admissions that 82% experience physical abuse, 58% experience financial abuse, and 74% were fleeing from common law partnerships. So what does this mean? It means we have to dig deeper and we have to go further into looking at how we experience the community. When we look at the community widely, we see, based on Stats Canada report, where disability is occurring. St. John at 41.6%, for example. And if we look at Riverview, Edmundston, all across the province, there's not an area that we can say there's a good story about the occurrence of disability. It is increasing, it is climbing, and more supports are needed. So what does this mean going forward? Let us talk about how this connects to my research briefly. Before closing off, I would like to say something about how I would like to use research as a way of creating a path towards liberatory initiatives. In my postdoc research, I will be creating a digital visualization map for accessible healthcare across New Brunswick health regions. The first stage of this is to conduct research that will provide information from key informants about the events of disability and how our systems are operating. In terms of my research, my goal is to contribute to the call for action for barrier-free access to healthcare, which is among the most pressing social issues confronting New Brunswick. My goal is to link to the province's legislative agenda as espoused by New Brunswick's Accessibility Act to achieve a more accessible New Brunswick by 2040. As the Purdy Crawford TD Postdoctoral Fellow in Accessibility, my project plan is entitled Undue Hardship in Disability Healthcare Access, a historical perspective for intersectional change. I will examine the systemic barriers to healthcare access with emphasis on lived experiences of disabled women in 3 phases, starting with a scoping review of historical contemporary matters, and then a phase 2 to look into conducting key informant interviews across the sector of healthcare, human rights, social services, and governance. And phase 3 involves the creation of a digital map, which hopefully will reside in New Brunswick so we can continue to trace our steps forward, achieving health equity for all. Thank you. And over to you, Stefanie.
Thank you, friend. I will be quick. As a historian of slavery and a survivor myself of family violence, I understand that the family can be a site of care and protection and survival, and a site of potential for harm. So growing up alongside disabled siblings in a culturally disabled home and later acquiring disabilities myself, these things have shaped my intellectual and personal commitment to disability liberation. And together, these personal and scholarly experiences drew me toward histories of disability and ultimately to my current research, which is on violence against disabled children. So in Canada, children with disabilities face disproportionately high rates of violence. Research estimates that they're up to 5 times more likely to experience violence than non-disabled children. They are twice as likely to experience sexual violence, while children with intellectual disabilities are nearly 4 times more likely to experience sexual violence. These realities are shaped by multiple structural factors, including reliance on care from individuals outside of the immediate family, barriers to communication and disclosure, social isolation, institutionalization, and the persistent devaluing of disabled lives. So my current research project is to crip sex education as a critical prevention strategy against gender-based violence and sexual violence. So to crip sex ed, by that I mean to center disabled people, find creative methodologies to uplift disabled voices, and confront the institutional silences around disability. To crip also means to reckon with ableism. So in collaboration with disabled youth, disability community organizations, and my colleagues at the University of New Brunswick, our research program seeks to create disability-centered, accessible sex education for disabled and non-disabled youth. So the compulsory desexuality or asexuality that society imposes on disabled people has led to misinformed sex education and a general lack of disability-centered information, which puts disabled youth at greater risk of experiencing and sometimes perpetrating acts of gender-based violence. So engaging with disabled youth as sources of knowledge We will create sex education resources by and for disabled youth that emphasize consent, bodily autonomy, safety, health, joy, pleasure, and desire. And central to this work is the belief that access to knowledge, resources, and communities that affirm the dignity and self-determination of disabled youth is key to preventing sexual violence against disabled children and youth. And that's that. Thank you for listening. I realize we went over time, so I appreciate everyone's patience.
Thank you both so much for such a powerful and enthralling presentation. I tend to so I'm just trying to figure out how to get everyone on the screen. There we go. Sorry. My tech skills were not the best today, apparently. It was so enthralling, and I know I learned a lot, and I bet everyone here did too. So while I leave some space for people to ask questions, I did want to ask, because both of you are doing such important disability justice work, for researchers in the field of gender-based violence who haven't done enough or who really want to get into the field of including disabilities in their work, do you have recommendations for where to start?
Yvonne, do you want to say something there?
Yeah. That is a challenging question because the field of disabilities is growing, right? So there are a number of Canadian institutions providing courses and teaching from a critical disability studies lens about disability. So, a place to start may be to look into and start the inspection. What is it that I would like to learn? And perhaps then what institutions may be offering my area of interest. I won't name any because I don't want to promote any particular institutions, but I want to say in Canada, we're fortunate. There's a wide breadth of disability scholarship and disability studies programs available. So that's one place to start. We've actually also included in our PowerPoint slide deck today a number of resources that people can begin to sort of do some exploration. Just there's the listing of the bibliography and references, maybe a place to start as well, to just maybe start doing some reading. So start small and then expand out and look at disability studies here in Canada. I'm a big supporter of what we have available here in Canada to offer. What's that?
Absolutely. Thank you. And then thinking about your work, and I know you have a lot of overlap, but a lot of diversity in your work as well. Some of the folks who attend our weekly webinars are practitioners and community members, and they're not academics. So from the takeaways of your work, are there things that practitioners and community service workers could do to start to implement these things in their work to make their spaces safer and more inclusive of people with disabilities?
I think the first thing is, as Yvonne mentioned in her presentation, the disability axiom, nothing about us without us. So for too long, I mean, and it continues. There's been this kind of us and them, and really like centering disabled people and working with them. So not just kind of like studying them or seeing disabled people as, as objects of your work, but really uplifting their voices and as I say, working with them as sources of knowledge. I think that's like the first kind of step toward really moving away from the medical model, which is still incredibly prevalent in how we view disability, and moving towards more of a disability justice or even a social model framework.
Well said. Dr. Simpson, do you have anything you'd like to add?
I thank you for those words, Stefanie. I completely agree with what you've just said. That inclusivity lens is really important. And I would only add, it seems like a mystique or something mysterious when we mention disability, I invite everyone to continue to reflect on what we've said here today, is that it is a human experience. We're all part of this. And if we begin to think that way, it shapes a way of changing our attitudes about this, rather than seeing this as one-off, as Stephanie's saying. Be inclusive. And being inclusive means perhaps seeing oneself in the picture, of being part of this, of us moving together in a way that we can all be part of the community, and not feel excluded or different, that we can have a sense of belonging in the community, regardless of our embodiment.
Thank you both so much. Those are incredibly powerful responses and mean so much, I think, for all of our audience here. So no other questions have hopped in either through the Q&A or through the chat. So I just wanted to say a big thank you from myself, as well as Ava and all of our attendees here today for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, and your time with us.
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to everyone who showed up.
Thank you.
You do, Yvonne.
Thank you. Thank you, Steph. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for welcoming us, and thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you both so much.